Loet and I have been talking for about just over 10 years now, I think, about his work, and it's a real pleasure to be able to contribute this. And I think there's something very, very important that we're doing today and over the next few weeks, which we rarely do, that we rarely see academics get together and teach each other's work, particularly while the academic is, the author is present. That's a very special thing. And I think what impresses me most about doing it in the context of this particular book is that in a way, Loet has given us a kind of compass for understanding this, for understanding what happens when we talk with one another about ideas in this particular way, in being able to talk about a book that one of us has written in a meaningful way. And that word meaning is so important. It's so central to what this book is about. And I think perhaps, without getting into the complexity of it, which I will hope to try and do justice to during this presentation, I think one of the things we're going to do over the next few weeks is express the same ideas because they're written in the book. And each of us going to do it in different ways. Each of us is going to give our own interpretation, our own version of this, of what Loet has written and the ideas that he's had. And I think there's something very important at a technical level that each of us is contributing to the generation of a redundancy. There's a redundancy between us. And this is a sort of key mechanism in doing meaningful things, having meaningful communications. And this is a core, this is not just the exercise that we're undergoing in meeting together like this, it's also what the book is about. And so that makes it special, I think. And, this generation of redundancy is contributing to a dynamics for producing meaning. And Loet belongs to a tradition in thinking about meaning and redundancy. So this is Gregory Bateson talking about the importance of redundancy and meaning. This is in Steps to an Ecology of Mind. I dug out this quote because I know Ava has had some association with Bernard about Gordon Pask. This is a quote from the Cybernetics of Human Learning and Performance, where Pask is talking about the process of teaching. And he's saying that the resilience of memory will depend upon the number of explanations produced in teachback. That's where the student teaches the teacher. And so he has many ways of reconstructing a concept, and this redundancy will combat the effect of interfering in incompatible learning experiences. This theme has been part of cybernetics for a long time, but I don't think it's been considered to this depth and with this coherence before. Now, I suppose getting into slightly more technical territory, I mean, this diagram on the left-hand side is something that's been key to the ideas in the book. This is the idea of double contingency, the idea that we can communicate because we entertain models of each other. And indeed, could we utter the words that we do if we didn't have some idea of how they were received by another person and how that other person would respond to them? And so our utterances sort of exist in this cloud of communication, which is drawn on the far left-hand side. But somehow there must be well, first of all, there's an overlap in the utterances that we make, and the overlap is drawn in that cloud, and that's a sort of you can talk about the mutual redundancy between our communications. But the most important thing is that our utterances are selected. We have to have some mechanism for selecting an utterance based on the model that we have of each other. And the really important question that I think Loet is addressing in this book is, how is this selection mechanism constructed? How is that higher order selection mechanism constructed, which steers our communications so that we understand and engage in each other in a meaningful way? and can we see it? Can we study it? What does it look like? What new insight does it give us if we can do this? And fundamentally, these are the core contributions that I think the book is making. And just to sort of emphasize the point, this is a direct quote. So the meaning of a communication is a second order variable attributable to the communications. The latter are first order attributes of communicating agents. But meanings originate from communications and feedback on communications. So we're making utterances, but there's a higher order mechanism which is steering those utterances, and that higher order mechanism is derived from the patterns in those communications. Now, just to step back, because what's also in chapter 1 is there's a mapping of the provenance of these ideas, the history that has led to these ideas of double contingency, which obviously comes from Niklas Luhmann, and the historical trajectory that Loet is building on. So we begin with Edmund Husserl, who has an idea of consciousness as something between minds. It's something between the communications in people. And although Husserl really considers the sort of situation of communication between two people, Alfred Schutz develops this into a much more elaborate communication of intersubjectivity. And the next really important connection is the friendship between Schutz and Parsons. And this is very well documented because Richard Grathoff wrote a wonderful book of the Parsons-Schutz correspondence, in which it's probably fair to say Parsons and Schutz disagree with one another in a very polite way. Parsons is after a more functional theory of communication, and Schutz is trying to sort of, he's a bit nervous about being too functional. But Schutz himself inspires the next generation of social constructivists, Berger and Luckmann's social construction of reality, while Parsons develops this idea of double contingency. And it's that idea which is then picked up by Niklas Luhmann. And Luhmann picks Parsons' ideas up in the context of the cybernetics of his time, particularly the cybernetics of Humberto Maturana. And later in his life, he picks up the cybernetics of George Spencer Brown, mathematical cybernetics of George Spencer Brown. So this is the tradition, really, where Loet is building on. And I think his influences, well, there's Daniel Dubois, who was a student of Robert Rosen and developed a way of thinking about the computational aspects of what Rosen called anticipatory systems. I'll talk about that in a second. And also Klaus Krippendorff, who's often in this group, who has done so much work on the complex dynamics of communicating systems in more than two dimensions, which has been a sort of a cybernetic question since Ross Ashby, really. So it's useful to know this history, and I think this is beautifully laid out in chapter 1. And I think the influence of Husserl on Luhmann, this is something I personally have really gained from talking to Loet over these years. Husserl's work is very complex and very difficult, and to see it in this sort of historical trajectory, I think, is very valuable. And I think, you know, this emphasis of the importance of Husserl on Luhmann is critical, really. Now, from a more practical point of view, of course, the cybernetic heritage gives us some operational tools, gives us ways of making measurements of communications. And I think, you know, perhaps, why is Shannon so useful? Why is Shannon so important? And because in a way, it's just statistics, it's just probability, but it's got something that other statistical techniques, like, for example, variance, don't have. And that's because it's relational. It's all about the relation between the sender and the receiver and their interactions. And that is such a key correlate of this idea of double contingency. And I think it's a stroke real brilliance that Loet has sort of put these things together to give us a way of making measurements and empirically exploring something which until this point had only really existed in theory. And the best diagram, this is not in chapter 1, but the best diagram in probably in the whole book is this elaboration of Shannon's communication model, where first of all, it was actually Warren Weaver who introduced this idea of semantic noise in the communication between sender and receiver. But then Loet, of course, points out, well, that's language. That's we resolve these differences of semantic noise with our correlations in language. But then again, this question of, okay, so what steers the process of that correlation? What steers the selection mechanism as to the words and the codes that we're using? And so there must be a higher level. But the beauty of this, I hope I can make this really clear, is there is a metric, there is a correlation between the use of the Shannon equations and this conceptual scheme. And that's what's really powerful here. Now, what's going on at the top here is some kind of anticipatory mechanism. It's some kind of anticipatory system where each of us is able to imagine the future communications of others in the light of our communications with them. And that is something that, that's a key question here as to how that works. Now, Luhmann had some insight into this, and this is a sort of his autopoietic model. I stole this diagram, but it's quite good because it brings out the importance of the biology and the relationship between the sort of biological foundations and the communicative operations. And obviously, Maturana was the key figure in Luhmann's conception of how communication systems operate as sort of quasi-biological systems. And actually, Loet does some nice critique of that later in the book about whether this is a kind of metabiology, which it isn't, or at least Luhmann might be, but Loet argues against that. But more importantly is the work of Robert Rosen, because biological systems, as Robert Rosen pointed out, well, biological systems and communication systems are anticipatory. The double contingency idea is an anticipatory mechanism. Again, I can only utter these words because I have some idea of how they're received. So I'm predicting how people are going to respond. And Rosen really pointed out that in biology, the same thing happens in biological systems. Biological systems contain models of themselves which are anticipatory of their environment. There's plenty of evidence in biology proper to suggest that this is actually the case. Our immune system wouldn't work unless something like that was going on. And because we've got this anticipatory mechanism, then the possibility is there to do simulations around these anticipatory systems. And this has been such an important part of Loet's work. So it's not just an analysis of communication based on Shannon, but also the ability to do some kind of simulation and to explore the difference between the dynamics of the simulation and the observed dynamics of those systems that we actually see around us. And just to look at Rosen's ideas, this is what he says. So this idea of anticipatory systems, that's fine. We talk about people and communication. What about organizations? So organizations operate on the same principles, and this is really building on the foundation of the triple helix, which Loet has contributed to, and he talks about the relation between universities, governments, and industry as a kind of anticipatory dynamic. This is, in these terms, it's a hypercycle, but basically these are discursive entities or contributing to a discourse which is anticipating the operations of each other, and there's a dynamic that forms through that. there must be some kind of fractality. I suppose this is more me than Loet, but there must be some kind of fractality in the communications where past events can be codified in a way which map onto possible futures. But and it's very interesting to think about current AI, current artificial intelligence, which looks very much like an anticipatory system. I don't know if anybody's seen this stuff, but this looks very similar to the kind of things that Loet is talking about. So I think this is work which is pointing very much to the future. And this is my last slide. I just want to talk about one final key idea in the book, which is about the distinction between dualism and monism. And really, there's a lot of discussion about structure and agency in sociology at the moment as a sort of either a dualist, it's portrayed as a dualist thing. Within the critical realist view, for example, I know one or two of you here are interested in Roy Basker and Margaret Archer's work. There is a kind of a distinction made between what's called an intransitive domain, a sort of mind-independent reality, and the transitive domain. But this is not very satisfactory because it leads us to a sort of metaphysical assumptions which aren't really testable. There's very interesting ideas around in Giddens' structuration theory, very similar to critical realism, but Giddens doesn't say that there's ontologically distinct transitive and intransitive domains. He basically says these arise out of intentionality. So it's basically, there's some single source for all of this, but it's never really articulated as to what the dynamics are. Where do the dynamics come from in that situation? And we get a similar problem in Latour. Now, if you compare these with what I think is Loet's dualism, which is between expectation and communication, I think this is much more satisfying. It's much richer. And I think also the connections between this dynamic, this dualism, not only gives us a motor for explaining how knowledge organizes itself in society, but it also gives us tools for measuring it. So that's it, really. And I think just to come back to the idea of teaching, that what we're going to be doing over the next few weeks is enacting this dynamics of knowledge. Okay, that's it. Thank you very much.